Hi everyone, and welcome to this Valkyrie sound tutorial. In this video we're going to create our own version of Animalese, the quaint language of Animal Crossing. As a concept, Animalese is really interesting. It's a pseudo-language where each letter in a word is pronounced instead of pronouncing the whole word itself. For this tutorial I've recorded myself saying the alphabet in what we in the UK call baby talk, and have pitch shifted these recordings up and trimmed them down using Audacity. You can download my recordings using the link in the description below. So we're building this system in Unreal Engine 5, which is still in early access, and I'm using version EA2. We're using the standard third-person character template, and I've created a new folder in the content browser, and inside this I'm going to right-click, go to Sounds, and Metasound. Now I've called mine MS Valkyrese, but you can call yours whatever you like. So let's load up my existing Metasound. So from the input on play node, we're going to add the trigger repeat node. There's a number of different types of triggers. We want the trigger repeat. From the stop input, we're going to promote to graph input, and I've named that stop speech. From the period, we're going to add a float to time node, and to the input of that one, we are going to add another promote to graph input, which we'll call repeat delay. And that's going to tell this node, this trigger repeat, how often to trigger the repeat. Later on, we'll update this input from our blueprint. From the trigger repeat node's repeat output, we're going to add the get wave asset array node. And from the array, we're going to drag off and promote that one to a graph input as well. And I've named mine English alphabet. Using the files in the download link in the description below, add 28 items to this new array. 0 to 25 for the letters A through Z, an empty item at 26, and I've added a 100 millisecond silence at index 27. So here, 26 blank, 27, we have our silence for 100 milliseconds. In order to input changes to the Metasound, we need the sound to be playing, but we don't want to play any audio until we're ready to tell Metasounds which specific characters we want to hear. From index, we are again going to promote to graph input, and I've named this one sound selected. And I put a default value there of 26, which is our blank item. Now that we have our array and our sound selector set up, we'll add a wave player node from the trigger repeat node as well. So from here, we just want the regular wave player. Hook up the element output of the get wave asset array node into the wave asset input of the wave player node. And we'll collect the wave player nodes out left and out right to the output node. And that's it. That's the Metasound complete. Next, we're going to create our Animalese speaker. For this, we need a blueprint actor. So right click, blueprint class, and then actor. And I've called mine BP Valkyries character. Just open that up. And this is what we're going to create. If we start off in the viewport, I've added the tutorial TPP asset, which is here. Just clicked and dragged that into the blueprint. And I've applied an idle animation, which is the tutorial idle. I also happen to have put two sausages in his hands, but that is entirely optional. To the skeletal mesh, we'll add a collision sphere, and I've set the radius here to 250. When the player enters this radius, we'll enable interaction between the player and the NPC. We'll also add an audio component. I've called mine AC speech, and we'll assign our Metasound to the sound option here in the settings on the right. So we have our MS Valkyrese. In this example, I'm not using attenuation or adjusting anything else. So in my example, once the player has finished talking to the NPC, I spawn some sausages. This is entirely optional. I'm going to show you those parts of the blueprint that make this happen, but we won't go into any detail about them. With that out of the way, select the sphere collision, and add an onComponent begin overlap sphere node. Select the sphere again and add the onComponent end overlap node. From the begin overlap node, we'll add a branch node, and we'll do a check here to confirm that it's the player character which has overlapped the sphere. So we'll get player character, and from there we want the equal sign plugged into other actor, and that hooks up to the condition input of the branch node. Next, we'll create a new variable called canTalk, and if the player is overlapping the sphere, then we'll set canTalk to true. So we'll attach that to the true output of our branch node. Next, we'll add an enable input node, which is this one, and to the player controller input, we'll add a get player controller node. Now, when we add our audio component, we left the auto activated box checked. So that is true. This means the Metasound will play via the audio component. However, because we're going to be silencing the audio component when the player exits the collision sphere, we'll need some functionality to ensure the Metasound is told to play the sound again whenever the player re-enters the sphere. So all we need to do is drag in a reference to that audio component, which I've got here, and then from that, we want the regular play node. And just make sure that's hooked up to the enable input node. From the end overlap node, we begin pretty much the same way, checking that it's the player who is overlapped, and moving on to the set canTalk variable, this time to false. After this node, we're going to disable input from the player controller, and that stops the blueprint from taking player input once they're no longer inside the collision sphere. Next, we'll add a fade out node, again attached to our audio component, and we'll set the fade out duration to 1, so it will fade out over a period or duration of 1 second. These three nodes here enable us to effect a change in the Metasound. So again, drag in a reference to the audio component, and from that we want to get parameter interface node, and then in this particular case we want to add a trigger node. So that'd be trigger interface call, and here we just put down the name of the trigger that we want to call in the Metasound. In this instance, it's the stop speech trigger, which is this one here. When the player leaves the collision sphere, we want to tell the Metasound to stop triggering this trigger repeat node. Following this, we have a small section that will fade out our subtitle text. As we need to create a widget for that, we'll do that next. So first of all, we're going to create two new variables. They are a text variable called speech text. So we've got the variable type of text here, and I've made it editable, and you can put in all the text that you want this particular character to say. And we want a float variable called delay duration with a value there, a default value of 0.1. Next we're going to go to edit, project settings, and input. You can see I've added a new action mapping, which I've called interact, and I've assigned that to the key of E. For the widget side of things, in the content browser we are going to right click, user interface, and widget blueprint, and you can call this whatever you like. I've called mine UE5 captions. In the designer pane, I've added two horizontal boxes in the same location as each other, and if you have keen eyes, you'll see that the Z order for that one is 0, and for this one it is 1, which means that the one with the higher Z order will sit on top of the other one. And that's just so we can have a shaded area behind the text. So to the second horizontal box, I've added an image, and I've added just a black color to it with an opacity or an alpha of 0.25. Horizontal alignment, fill horizontally, fill vertically. I've added a text box to the first horizontal box. Again, fill horizontal and vertical, and I've just put some text in there. Next, in the graph section, we're going to add a new function, which I've called write text. So that's just plus and then write text. Thanks to Nebula Games for their tutorial on the typewriter text effect. I'm using a modified version of their setup for this video. And we're going to add two new variables, current character and built text. And these have empty default values, and they are both text variables. From the beginning of our write text function, we'll set the built text variable. Next, we'll drag in a reference, a get, to the built text and the current character. We'll use the string append node to add the current character to the built text, and then pass this along to a toText string and add that to the built text. Every time this function is going to be called, it will add one character to built text, and the character it's going to add is whatever the current character value is. Next, we'll drag in a reference to the text box that we created, and from it we'll add a setText node, setText, and it's the setText text node that we need. Connect the built text output to the inText and make sure the execution is connected as well. Going back to the event graph, from the event preconstruct node, we'll get actor of class, which will be the blueprint for our NPC. So for me, that is the BP Valkyrese character, and we're going to cache a reference to that by peeling off from return value and promote to variable. Next, we'll add a custom event, which I've called initiate, and to that we're going to add a customized macro. This macro is a modified version of the for each loop node, and it contains a delay node, which allows us to work through an array of letters, in this case at an observable speed, getting us that typewriter effect with the text. So first of all, add a for each loop node to your graph and double click on it. You'll be taken to the standard macros tab, and you'll be able to see the inner workings of this node. Do not, absolutely do not, fiddle around with it. We're going to leave this macro exactly as it is. All we're going to do is copy the nodes that are in here, and we'll use them in a custom macro we'll make inside the widget. So before we close down the standard macro, we do need to make sure that we have the same setup for the inputs and the outputs. So we have the custom one on the left here, and we have the original on the right. So for the inputs on the custom one, we have this, and we need to make sure that it matches the inputs of the one that comes with the engine. So we need an exec input. So I've left mine blank here, and it's exec, which is just the white one here. Then we have another element, which is called array. That is a wildcard input, so make sure that one is an array. For our custom one, we're going to add the duration input as well. So this is the float variable. It's important to know where these are hooked up as well. The exec input is connected to the assign exec input. The array is connecting to the length node in the test loop condition section and to the get node in the execute loop body. And the duration pin is connected to a delay node, which I'll talk about in a moment. The output nodes on both the custom macro and the standard macro are exactly the same. We have loop body, which is an exec. We have array element, which is a wildcard. We have an array index, which is an integer pin, and we have the completed value, which is the exec as well. So now that we've copied everything and we set up our inputs and outputs, we can close this, and we'll just check where we need to connect the outputs pins. So the loop body is connected to the sequence node, the then zero output from the execute loop body section. The array element is connected to the get node. The array index connects all the way along to the local integer from the array index, and completed connects to the false output of the branch node. So I've called this macro for each loop delayed, and to the input I've added an additional input, a duration variable of float type. And then I've connected this to a delay node, which takes the execution output of the increment loop counter assign node here and routes into the test loop condition branch node here. So that's our input, and here is our output. And in the event graph, we would then just drag in our new custom function, which I have here, and then we need to drag in a reference to our blueprint. From there, we need to get the speech text, so get speech text, and we need to get the delay duration. From the speech text node, add a get character array from string node. So get character array from string. You may have to untick the context sensitive box, but it will convert it to the right type. It's because we're going from text to string. And then we'll attach that return value, that array output, to the array input of our custom macro. This converts each character in the speech text to an individual array item. We're then going to connect the delay duration output to the input, the duration input of the custom macro we've made. From the macro's loop body execution output, we'll add a set current character node, and it's the array element that needs to be connected to the current character input. Then we'll connect this to our custom function, writeText. From our macro's completed output, add a set built text node, but leave the input as blank. This takes each letter from our speech text, and it prints it in the text box we added to the widget, one letter at a time. When the for each loop delayed node reaches the final array item and it's completed, it empties the built text variable ready for an additional text that you might want to display. And that's the end of the widget section. With that done, we can now return to the NPC blueprint. With our collision section set up, now we'll create the code that will display our widget and close it again when the player moves away from the non-player character. So we added a new action mapping earlier called interact. Right click and add that to the blueprint now. So you can right click and type in the name of the action event and it will appear here. From there, we're going to create a widget, and then we specify the name of the widget, which for me is UE Valkyrese captions. Right click and promote this to a value so we can cache a reference to that. I've renamed this particular variable speech UE, but you don't need to. From the output pin of that, we're going to add to viewport and connect that reference up to that. And then we're going to take a reference to our widget, and then we're going to add the initiate node, the custom function that we added to the widget earlier. That creates the widget when we talk to the NPC. To hide it, if you go back to the end of the onComponentEnd overlap sequence, where we added the trigger for the stop speech trigger inside the Metasound, we'll add a timeline node, and inside that, we'll set the length to 1, and we'll add 2 keys. The first key will have coordinates 0 and 1, and the second key will have coordinates of 1 and 0. And we'll use this to fade the widget out. Back in the event graph, make sure it is the play from start input that's connected to the trigger. And then we're going to drag in another reference to our widget, and we are going to set render opacity with the new float track that we've created, and we're going to set visibility, and we'll set that to hidden. And that's all of the widget parts done. We'll move on to the next step, which is to add a sequence node. From the initial output of the sequence node, we're going to add another set of nodes that will communicate with our Metasound. This time we're going to set how quickly the individual sounds will play, how quickly that delay duration is going to trigger. So we need another reference to the audio component. Again, we're going to get parameter interface, and for this one, because it's that float value, the repeat delay here, because it's a float value, we are going to set float, and it's the interface call, not the array. The name is going to be repeat delay, the same name we gave the input parameter in our Metasound, and the float input value is going to be our delay duration variable here, which we created earlier on. By default, that is 0.01, but you can experiment with different values for your own setup. From the second output of the sequence node, we're going to add a new custom macro. This is basically a variation of the one we added to our widget. So we'll add a new macro, and this time instead of going to the standard macros, it's a little bit safer just to pull it from our existing custom macro in the widget. So select everything in there, copy that, and paste it in. Again, we're going to need to go through the inputs and outputs to make sure that they are set up as they should be. And for now, we want them to be exactly the same as they are in our widget. And that's more or less the same setup we're going to use for this custom macro. You'll see that we have an extra section here. can the NPC still talk? That is to see if our can talk variable is still true. If it is, we'll keep the for each loop going around, but if it stops being true, that is if the player moves out of the collision sphere, then we won't progress the for each loop any further. That stops the audio from continuing to play if the player exits and re-enters the sphere. So, before the delay node, but after the increment loop counter assign node, we want to add a branch node, and we'll drag in our reference to the can talk variable that we made earlier on. Back in our event graph, we're going to drag in a reference to the speech text variable that we created earlier and add a get character array from string node in exactly the same way that we did for our widget. The delay duration is again going to be connected to that duration input value of the for each loop delayed with check node, our custom macro. From the loop body node, we're going to add a branch node, and here we're going to check if any of the characters in our speech text aren't a part of the alphabet. If they aren't, we'll assign a silent WAV to them, but we could just as easily assign any type of sound if we wanted to. So I've created a new string variable called non-alpha characters, and this is a string variable with a type of array. And I've added a few elements in here. We've got a space, we've got a comma, full stop, exclamation mark, question mark, and an apostrophe. Once we've updated that, we'll drag in a reference to it, and then from that we'll add the contains node. And this is going to check if the string input contains any of the values from this array that we've just made. So we'd hook that up to the array element output of the custom macro that we made, and we'll connect the return value, the boolean, to the branch condition input. From the true output, we're adding another Metasound communication section. We've got our audio component reference here, then the get parameter interface node, and this time we're going to use the set int node for set integer. And again, it's the interface call. The name is sound selected, and the value is 27. That is the position on our English alphabet array for the silence WAV. The silence is 100 milliseconds long, so it's a perfect fit given the length of the delay duration, but only because it means that the subtitles appear at the same rate as the NPC's rate of speech. If we didn't do anything here, if we didn't specify any sound at all, and the Metasound simply ignored non-alphabet characters, then any subtitle text that we did use would be delayed by however many non-alphabet characters your text contains. From the branch's false output, we'll post a copy of that Metasounds set int section from here, down below. Only this time we'll use our custom macro to tell the Metasound which character it should play. So from the array element, we're going to add a find node, and this gets us a map related node, and what we'll do is we'll create a map variable. So you can peel off from there and go to promote variable. I've called mine letter to int, and that's basically just a string. If I widen this, you can see they have a string variable. I've selected map, and I've made the right hand value an integer. And then the boring part is adding all of the letters from here, from A to Z, and then from 0, because remembering that the arrays run from 0 to 25, and if it's set up correctly, then this will match exactly what we have in our Metasound for the English alphabet array that we made earlier. We then hook up the letter to int to the map input of that find node, and we connect its output to the value input of our set int node. I've added a small debug section here so I can see what letter is being called and the corresponding item number from the map, but that's optional. Next, from the completed output pin of our custom macro, we're going to paste in again another set int node, and this time the value is going to be 26. This returns the Metasound back to the original state before we initiated speech with the NPC. After that set int, we're going to duplicate the section to trigger stop speech in the Metasound, and that prevents the Metasound from triggering the last character in our speech text variable. And that's it. So let's compile and save this, and then we'll go into our map and we'll test this out. Thanks for watching.